I recently posted a video and it got a lot of comments on it. And some of these comments were basically like, hey, you can't own real estate in Mexico, you know, foreigners can't do it, all this stuff, and I get it. But what kept popping up is people were trying to say, oh, the Mexican government can take your property whenever they want to and all this, and that just is not the case. You know, is there any case that you can remember where the Mexican government actually took a property from somebody in Los Cabos or in Mexico?
Well, obviously, you have to go back a little bit to the genesis of how foreign ownership came about in Mexico, and it's obviously indirect ownership through a trust, because again, the Mexican Constitution does have a restriction for fee simple ownership on the part of foreigners. That's why the use of a trust is required under the Constitution and under the foreign investment laws. So the comment of foreigners cannot own land is technically accurate as far as direct ownership of the land goes, but that does not avoid the fact that there are millions and millions of dollars invested in properties in Mexico owned by foreigners through a Mexican trust, and they are the trust beneficiaries under the trust permits that are now issued for 50 years, and they're renewable. And so to your point of seizure on the part of Mexico government, I have not seen any type of, government stepping in and saying, okay, we will take away this property, because you're a foreigner. The issues of seizures of property come about if there are, let's say, illegal activities related to that, money laundering, things under what we call the National Extinction Law, Ley de Extinción de Dominio, for ownership extinction law. Basically, it's an adverse domain. It's some sort of expropriation, but it has to go through the courts, and there has to be due process, and they have to basically prove that there are certain things going on, in particular with that property. But just because people have trust does not mean that the governments can step in and take away the property. It's ironclad because under the Mexican Constitution, Article 1, it's very clear. All of the guarantees that are afforded under the Mexican Constitution are both for Mexican citizens and individuals and foreigners. There's not a distinction. So everything that people say that, people can say, oh, I will lose my property because I'm a foreigner, is just complete nonsense. You have this permit, and I've never seen a situation where, people said, the government took away my property. What I have seen are people buying into ejido land, having then even built properties, and then, having the courts intervene saying, well, wait a minute, this was communal property. You did not have a right to that. There is no trust involved. And yeah, they were kicked out. There was an issue 21 years ago in Ensenada called Punta Banda. And people basically knew what they were going into. They then cried wolf and said, hey, the government did this. Well, there was a reason that they did this. Is because the ejido, the workers came together and said, hey, this is property that did not belong to you. You were there illegally, even if you happen to construct an improvement on the land. That was also not proper, and they got kicked out. And so that's what sometimes the news feeds on these types of stories. And even though it's 1,200 miles north of Cabo, years and years ago, I remember, people had some reservations for this type of ownership. And this trust is actually the use of and enjoyment of property. And it's actually not a lease, because the lease is different. The lease does not convey ownership rights. The trust is not that it conveys ownership rights, but it conveys an indirect ownership, because even though the legal title is with the bank, beneficial title is with the trust beneficiary. So it's only for the benefit of the trust beneficiary that the bank says, okay, I hold title so that I, a Mexican entity, a Mexican bank, can comply with the Mexican Constitution, but I happen to use that for the benefit of these trust beneficiaries under a trust. And so I can actually assign my trust beneficiary rights to other foreigners and using that same 50-year permit. So if I have 10 years on mine and I have 40 years to go, I can freely assign those to others, and it's basically a transfer of title. And the trustee holds the property, and it's the same trustee, and they basically sanction that sale down the road, which is 80% of the properties that I've looked into subsequently get sold by other people. Sometimes, Mexico nationals come in and they are the ones to extinguish the trust because they don't need it. But as we recalled in other conversations, the trust has the ability to be used as a anti-probate device, let's say. So it's actually proper to have a trust, because if you don't have a will, you have the provisions of the trust, and you can actually have a substitute trust beneficiary take the property in the event of death. That is not available if it's direct or fee simple ownership. You have to go through the courts and you have to go through the will. So those are the benefits. But yeah, it's not accurate that people say that what people are saying that the government can take away the property. It's not. It doesn't happen like that.
Yeah. So recap: government is not going to take your property unless you're doing something nefarious, like dealing drugs out of it.
And even that, it has to go through the courts.
Yeah.
Due process.
And it's really just make sure you have properly titled land or building, and that's not hard in a market like Cabo because you have so many professionals. And this is another thing, they're like, you don't own the property, and it's like, if you buy something for $300,000 and sell it a couple years later for $450,000, if you don't own the property, why are you responsible for the capital gains taxes, right? It's not like, oh, the Mexican government's going to come in and pay those for you, Yeah. So it's just a myth that's out there, and once again, that was just more, I wouldn't call them uneducated buyers that were looking at it, but it wasn't sophisticated people that were down here looking at property. It's just, but there is a large narrative in the United States, through whatever bad education
exactly.
or whatever.
And it might be ignorance simply because they haven't been explained the process of, look, it is actually not fee simple ownership, but there is indirect ownership regarding this through a trust. And it's a Mexican bank that has a bank charter. So it's not like, and that's one of the reasons why the Mexico system is more rigid, but it's also more solid. Only banks can serve as trustees. You do not have individuals act as trustees. You don't even have entities that are not banks serving as trustees. So that actually conveys that sense, because it's not every run-of-the-mill entity that can have a bank charter, right? It has to have certain requirements. So that's also a proper guarantee, and you can imagine the amount of investment that is conveyed through these trusts all across Mexico in the beach area.